Right, so I'm going to change pace and perspective somewhat. We've had two fantastic talks really engaging with current practices and concerns around personalised medicine, some of the details of the work that's ongoing within and in relation to personalised medicine. I'm a historian and sociologist of medicine and medical science, and I'm currently working in a Wellcome Trust funded project on the recent history of genetics and genomics in medicine since the 1970s. And I want to step back to think a bit more broadly about where some of the hypes, well, a lot of the concerns, a lot of the promissory language of recent medicine has come from, and think about some of the issues about where and why promise might fold over into hype and how we think about the relationships between those. And I want to think about this in broad historical perspective from the 1960s and to think about the changing expectations of science and especially medical science more generally. And just thinking about where promise enters into and expectations, social expectations, enter into science, and especially medical science, where they come from. So we can think about, and historians, sociologists do talk about how in the 1960s and 1970s, the social contract with science, the expectations, social expectations of science changed quite significantly, and reasons why they did. So up until the 1960s or so, the social contract with science, social expectations of science, revolved to a very large extent really just around leaving academic scientists to pursue their own pure or basic scientific interests in the expectation that this would inevitably and necessarily lead to beneficial innovations, including medical developments. Now, of course, the extent to which that science was ever really pure is very much moot and has been analysed a lot by historians. Scientists' interests, of course, were typically inflected by, were coloured by some kind of orientation towards delivering or fostering social benefits of one kind or another. Pure science wasn't socially disengaged. And often that kind of engagement was facilitated by formal or informal links to the world of policy or of industry or of commerce. But insofar as there were the social mission of science was informed by broader social expectations, expectations of social progress, those expectations were typically implicit, they were vague, and they were extremely general. There was simply an expectation that scientists would do good if left to their own devices. But from the late 1960s, this changed quite markedly with growing demands that scientists should demonstrate that they were delivering public benefit in return for public funding, and concern at the increase in public funding, especially for medical sciences, was really quite an important factor in this. But there are also other sources for this expectation that public benefit should be definable and should be demonstrable. These included political concerns, and especially on the left there was a lot of concern about the high levels of military funding for science, and this itself led to greater public scrutiny of science's social function, with debate about how science should be directed. But another major driver, and one that I'll really dwell on, especially in the USA, was the pharmaceutical industry. And from the 1960s, the pharmaceutical industry campaigned for much greater access to and much more control over the products of public research, and especially they sought to secure more favourable policies on the patenting of public research. And central to the claims made by the pharmaceutical industry and their supporters, politicians, policymakers, economists, who weighed in at this time, central to these arguments was the claim that medical advances were being squandered because there was no incentive to commercialise them, that good discoveries were sitting on the shelves because there was no motive to commercialisation. These arguments for commercialization as the means to deliver social benefit, and the equation that was made here between commercialization and social benefit in medicine, were boosted in part by fears that America was failing to keep pace with the rapid growth of what was seen to be science and technology-based economies at that time, especially the post-war recovery in Germany and Japan. Science technology-based recoveries that was seen to be outstripping the United States, and there was a big concern that America needed to up its innovation game to keep pace with these economies. So economic growth in particular was seen as an important factor, that science should be harnessed to driving economic growth. So in effect, the social benefits of science now came increasingly to be identified with successful commercialization, and this was embodied in policy probably most obviously in the United States in the passage of the Bayh-Dole Act in 1980, which made it much easier for the products of publicly funded science to be patented and then commercialized, and increased the incentives for commercialization, especially again in relation to pharmaceuticals. Similar views were established, albeit more slowly, in the United Kingdom and elsewhere in Europe. In many ways, a sort of greater commitment to publicly funded means of innovation rather than the strong commitment to commercialization was, in many ways, a mitigating factor in the way that things developed in the UK and Europe. But nonetheless, I mean, even now we hear a lot of talk about how innovation in the UK, including biomedical innovation, is the way to ensure a vibrant economy, to ensure continuing economic leadership and economic health in the UK. Now, in the 1970s into the 1980s, the main site, if you like, of where this new vision of commercialized science was worked out was in relation to the biotechnology sector. And biotechnology really became something of a poster child for the way in which promotion of commercialization in relation to publicly funded science would lead to, or lead to expectations, at least, of economic growth. So the biotechnology sector revolved around new intellectual property-based business models, and it was quite striking in the way, and continues to be striking in the way, that it blurs distinctions between academic research on the one hand and commercial innovation in the other. So biotechnology was both a beneficiary and, in many ways, an important exemplar of this new vision of how science should deliver social benefits. This was very much based on promise. The biotech sector has taken an awfully long time, compared to those early promises, to actually start to deliver profitability on any kind of scale. So promise was absolutely central to this, the growth of the biotech sector and the way it became a policy poster child. But that dependence on promise shouldn't necessarily be seen as a negative aspect of the biotech business model. In fact, promise was actually intrinsic, it was central to the financing and economic modelling of the biotech centre. Biotech relied very heavily on a substantial input of venture capital investment, which is by its nature speculative. It builds on and works with promise. And that the role of promise in creating the biotechnology sector was absolutely crucial for building the economic expectations and recycling those as a way of then furthering investment. Very heavily underwritten, of course, by public research funding, but that in many ways was a way of shoring up the promise of biotech. Promise is, of course, especially when you're talking about business, when you're talking about marketing, when you're talking about securing funding, promise is very prone to spill over into hype, to exaggeration. But that also is simply part of the game of speculative business investment. Managing promise, managing hype is a big part of the way that biotech is actually financialized and the way that it's funded. I was quite struck in Tim's presentation earlier. Tim showed a graph of hype, and so the graph which had the peak of inflated expectations, the trough of disillusionment, and then the plateau of enlightenment. That graph is very widely circulated whenever people are talking about hype and promise. That graph is called the Gartner hype cycle. Gartner is a very successful high-tech business consultancy working primarily in the area of information technologies. It advises on where you should put your money, trust funds, investment funds of one sort or another. And that the Gartner hype cycle is very widely circulated. It's not a particularly good description of the way that most innovations proceed, but it is a very useful fiction if you want to manage hype and expectation in relation to investments. I think it's quite striking the way that it now seems to be filtering through into more discussions of like this one. I mean, the discussions about where we go in terms of hype and expectation. That it's striking that the models we draw on are models from business and from particularly the venture capital side of business. And the way that our thinking is inflected by those models, I think, is quite telling. I've talked around about biotech in the 70s and 80s. Current activities around personalised medicine are, to a considerable extent, a direct continuation. Large parts of current personalised medicine are a direct continuation of this biotech model of science for social benefit. We can trace this continuity, for instance, in the shift from first-wave biotech to pharmacogenetics to stratified and targeted medicine. All a large part of the language of personalisation. And throughout all of this, we see the same configuration of actors, this linking of academia through biotech to pharma, to the pharmaceutical industry, including now increasingly the emergence of new intermediaries as well, new biotech sectors, for instance, bioinformatics. Throughout this as well, it's clear that a large part of the promise of developments in these areas remains closely linked to the successful commercialization of academic research, be it through the delivery of new pharmaceuticals or of new diagnostics, or increasingly of some combination of the two. So business remains deeply embedded in personalised medicine. It's a big part of the endeavour. And again, the fact that the promise of, or at least the hype of personalised medicine is still problematic in the way that it's being realised, it's very clear that this is not yet undermining those kinds of academia-business alignments and connections that are in place. Crucially, the commercialisation model remains a very large part of what is expected, what kind of promise revolves around personalised medicine. And we can talk about why that might be the case, but what's clear is that substantial public resources continue to be devoted to maintaining both the enterprise itself and the appearance that the promises it makes are being capable of delivered. So we see continuing, indeed increasing, public investment in areas of bioscience concerned with commercialization, and translational medicine has to be a very important aspect of this, an important part of this. And especially this, I think this is the case since the reduction in private venture investment since the 2008 crash. We also see mechanisms to maintain the profitability of drugs. Now, there are interesting and rather difficult issues around the fact that many of the new medicines that are coming out under the rubric of personalised medicine target very small populations, and in order to maintain the profitability of the pharmaceutical companies who manufacture them, they have to be sold at very high prices. And there are various policy mechanisms which have helped to facilitate this, and orphan drug legislation, I think, has to be an important part of this. So the way in which policy is helping to shore up a business model that is running into difficulties, I think, is important here. This then raises inevitably these questions that Sir John was raising about sustainability, about whether it's possible to sustain this kind of system of innovation, particularly with its links to the expectations of commercial success, and particularly defined in terms of profit. We might ask then, given this profound linkage between personalised medicine and the biotechnology activities that it involves, and business and the expectation of profit, whether, for instance, some kind of decoupling of these languages, of rhetorics, of the expectations, of the promises, of the hypes might be possible, and what personalised medicine would look like if we were not to completely discount commercialisation. I'm not saying that there's no place for commercial involvement, but the extent to which the commercial tail might be wagging the innovation dog, I think, is something we really need to think about and be very aware of when we talk about what personalised medicine is. And this then raises the question of how we innovate better. Again, we heard about innovating better, and I think that this is something that innovation is currently so bound up with commercialisation. How might we think about innovation if we don't concern ourselves so much with commercialisation?